I fell 3 steps from the bottom of my own staircase. 3 steps. After 67 years of living, after climbing ladders on job sites, after hiking trails in the Smokies with my wife before she passed, 3 ordinary carpeted steps put me flat on my back in my own hallway on a Tuesday morning in February. The pain hit before I even understood what had happened. My hip. Something was wrong with my hip. I reached for my phone on the floor beside me. It had slid out of my shirt pocket when I went down, and I called my son first. Not 911. My son, because that's what a father does. Even at 67, even lying on the cold floor with your vision going gray at the edges, your first instinct is to reach for your child. His name is my son, and he's 39 years old. He lives 14 minutes from my house. I know because I used to drive it every Sunday for dinner before his wife, Renee, made it clear that Sunday dinners were no longer a priority. That was 2 years ago. I stopped counting the Sundays after a while. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Dad, it's 7 in the morning. I fell," I said. "I think it's my hip. I can't get up." There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you everything. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll call someone. Can you come?" Another pause. "I've got a thing at 9. Let me call an ambulance for you." He called the ambulance. I'll give him that. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes, and they were kind. 2 young men who talked to me calmly and told me what they were doing before they did it. One of them picked up my phone from the floor and asked me if there was anyone they should contact. I gave them my son's number again. I don't know why. Habit, maybe? Or hope. Those 2 things are hard to tell apart when you get older. At the hospital, they confirmed a fractured hip. The doctor, a woman about my daughter-in-law's age, told me I would need surgery and then a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks in a rehabilitation facility before I could return home. She said it matter-of-factly, the way doctors do, and I nodded along like I was hearing about someone else's life. My son arrived at the hospital at 11:30 that morning. He was dressed for his meeting, sport coat, nice shoes, and he stood at the foot of my bed with his arms crossed and looked at me the way you look at a car that's broken down on the side of the road. Inconvenient, unfortunate, someone else's problem to solve. "So what's the timeline?" he said. "Not. How are you feeling?" "Not. I'm sorry this happened." The timeline. I told him what the doctor said. Surgery that afternoon, then rehab for 2 to 3 weeks, then home with some modifications needed, grab bars, possibly a shower chair, someone to check in regularly while I rebuilt strength. He nodded slowly. "Renee and I have the trip to Scottsdale at the end of the month." I looked at him for a long moment. "I know about the trip," I said. "I'm just saying, the timing isn't great. I fractured my hip on a Tuesday, son. I didn't plan it around your calendar." He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. He stayed for 40 minutes, scrolled his phone twice while the nurse explained my post-surgical care, then said he'd check in later and left to make his 9 o'clock meeting. I watched him walk out the door, and I thought about the morning 34 years ago when I held him in the hospital for the first time. This small, furious creature that was half me and half the woman I loved. And I thought about how certain I had been in that moment that I would burn the world down for him if I had to. The surgery went well. I woke up in a room on the 3rd floor with a window that looked out at a gray February sky and a physical therapist named Carol, who had a no-nonsense manner and kind eyes and told me I had good bone density for my age, which I chose to take as a compliment. My son came once in the first week. He brought a bag from the deli near his office, set it on the tray table, and spent most of the visit on his phone. When he left, I opened the bag and found a turkey sandwich I can't eat because of my blood thinner and a bag of chips. He's known about my blood thinner for 2 years. He did not come the 2nd week. I know because I counted. I had a lot of time to count things in that rehab facility. The ceiling tiles in my room. The number of times the aide knocked before entering. The days since my son had last visited. I am not a man who has ever asked for much. I built my own business from nothing. A small construction company that I ran for 31 years before I sold it and retired. I raised my son largely alone after his mother died when he was 22. I paid for his college, co-signed his first car loan, lent him $40,000 when his first business venture failed, and told him we didn't need to discuss repayment until he was on his feet. He got on his feet. We never discussed repayment. I am not telling you this to build a case. I'm telling you because you need to understand what I understood lying in that rehab facility in week 2, that I had been operating under a set of assumptions about my son that were simply not true. I had assumed that the foundation of what I'd built, the sacrifice, the patience, the $40,000, the 39 years of showing up, had created something solid between us. I had assumed that if I ever truly needed him, he would come. The assumption was wrong. The person who came instead was a woman named Ruth. Ruth was 71, a retired school principal from Dayton, Ohio, who was in the room next to mine recovering from knee replacement surgery. She had silver hair cut close to her head and a laugh that arrived without warning, loud and genuine, and she had a habit of knocking on my open door in the evenings and saying, "You want company, or do you want to feel sorry for yourself?" The first time she said it, I almost told her to mind her business. Then I laughed. I hadn't laughed in 11 days. We talked in the evenings, Ruth and I, about our lives, our kids, our late spouses. Her husband had died 6 years ago. Her daughter lived in Portland and called every other day. Her son lived in Columbus, 40 minutes away, and came 3 times a week with food from her favorite restaurant and a crossword puzzle book, because she'd mentioned once, years ago, that she liked them. "You're lucky," I told her one evening. "I know," she said. She didn't try to make me feel better about my own situation. I respected that. It was Ruth who first said the thing I'd been turning over in my mind, but hadn't been able to put into words. We were sitting in the common room one afternoon, watching a weak winter sun do almost nothing to the parking lot outside, and I had just gotten off a 5-minute phone call with my son, in which he mentioned, twice, that the Scottsdale trip was already paid for and non-refundable. "He's been waiting for you to make it easy for him," Ruth said when I told her about it. "What do you mean?" "I mean, every time he's let you down, you've absorbed it. You moved on. You didn't make him sit with the consequences." She paused. "So he's never learned that there are any." I thought about that for a long time after she went back to her room. My son called me on a Thursday evening during my 3rd week in rehab. I was doing better by then, walking the corridor with the physical therapist, getting my strength back, starting to feel like myself in my body again. When I saw his name on my phone, I felt the usual complicated mixture of things. Hope, wariness, love that hadn't gone anywhere even when I wanted it to. "Hey, Dad, so the Scottsdale trip is next week. We leave Saturday morning." "I know when you leave," I said. "You've mentioned it." "Right. So I wanted to let you know that Renee found a home health aid service that can come check on you when you get discharged. She got their number. I can send it to you." I sat with that for a moment. An aid service that he wanted me to arrange for myself from a rehab bed while he was in Arizona. "When are you coming to see me?" I asked. Silence. "I know you've been busy," I said, "but I'd like to know when you're planning to come." "Dad, it's been a complicated few weeks." "It's been a complicated few weeks for me too," I said. "I had hip surgery." "I know that. I've been in this facility for 21 days. You've come once." More silence. Then, "I'll try to come before Saturday." He did not come before Saturday. They left for Scottsdale on Saturday morning. I know because I called his cell and it went to voicemail. And then I called the house and Renee answered, slightly breathless, and said they were just heading out the door. Could she have him call me back? I said that was fine. He didn't call back. I was discharged on Monday. Carol, my physical therapist, went through the home care instructions with me. The aid service number was on my phone, sent by my son, and I called them from the facility and arranged for someone to come twice a week. I took a taxi home because there was no one else to call, and I sat in the back seat and looked out the window at my neighborhood coming into view, and I made a decision. Not an angry decision. I want to be clear about that. Anger is loud and hot, and it burns off quickly. What I felt was something quieter and more permanent. A clarity, almost. The kind that comes when you stop lying to yourself about a situation and simply see it for what it is. I had a son who would not show up for me. That was the fact. I could spend the rest of my years waiting for him to become the person I'd believed he was, or I could build a life that accounted for the person he actually was. One of those options had a future. The other one was just waiting to be disappointed. I called my attorney the following week. Her name is Patricia, and she's been handling my affairs for 15 years, and she didn't ask unnecessary questions when I told her I wanted to revisit my will and my general estate planning. She just scheduled the appointment. I also called a financial advisor I'd been referred to by an old colleague of mine, a woman named James's referral, as I thought of her, because that's how I heard about her. Her name was Donna, and she was sharp and direct, and helped me understand the full picture of what I had, what I'd built over 31 years of work, and what I wanted to happen to it. What I had was not nothing. The house paid off. The proceeds from the sale of my business, carefully invested. A retirement account. A small rental property across town that I'd bought 15 years ago, and mostly forgotten about until Donna reminded me it had appreciated considerably. I also had a will that left everything to my son. I spent 3 weeks thinking carefully, not reactively. I am not a man who makes decisions in the heat of the moment. That's not who I am, and it's not how I built what I built. I thought about what I actually wanted my legacy to be. I thought about the $40,000 never repaid, and about the Sunday dinners that stopped, and about the turkey sandwich with the chips. I thought about 21 days in a rehab facility and 1 visit. I thought about Scottsdale. And then I called Patricia and told her what I decided. I didn't write my son out entirely. That's not who I am either. But I restructured things considerably. A portion would go to him. A meaningful portion went to a scholarship fund I established at the trade school, where I'd learned my craft at 20 years old, for kids who wanted to learn a trade and couldn't afford it. Another portion went to a local organization that supports elderly residents who are isolated and lack family support nearby, the kind of organization I had needed in February and hadn't known to look for. I added Ruth as a beneficiary of a small personal bequest, because she'd given me something in that rehab facility that I couldn't put a dollar amount on, and I wanted her to know it. I also had the rental property transferred into a separate trust with specific terms. Patricia helped me make sure everything was airtight. She mentioned gently that these kinds of decisions were sometimes revisited when relationships improved, and I told her I understood that, and I wasn't closing any doors. I was just making sure that my life's work went somewhere meaningful if nothing changed. Then I did something I hadn't planned on. I wrote my son a letter, not to announce what I'd done. That wasn't the point. The letter was about the February I'd spent waiting for him. Not accusatory, not a list of grievances. I told him about the ceiling tiles I'd counted. I told him about Ruth and what she'd said about consequences. I told him that I loved him in the uncomplicated way that fathers love their sons, and that nothing about any of this changed that. But I also told him the truth, that I had needed him, that he had not come, and that I had spent a long time making excuses for choices he'd made with full awareness, and I was done doing that. I sealed the letter and put it in an envelope and set it on my kitchen table. I wasn't ready to send it yet. I wanted to sit with it first. My son came home from Scottsdale on a Sunday. He called me that afternoon, sounding relaxed, telling me about the weather and the resort and a golf course they'd played. I let him talk. I asked a few questions. We had 20 minutes of the most normal conversation we'd had in months, and part of me, the part that's still the man who held him in a hospital 34 years ago, felt the warmth of it and wanted to hold on to it. When there was a pause, I said, "I'd like you to come over this week. When you have time." "Sure, yeah. Maybe Wednesday?" "Wednesday works." He came on Wednesday. He looked tanned and healthy from the Arizona sun, and he stood in my kitchen, and I made coffee. And we sat at the table the way we used to sit on Sunday mornings when he was in high school, before everything got complicated, and for the first 10 minutes, it felt almost like that. Then he looked at the envelope on the table. "What's that?" "A letter," I said. "For you. But I want to talk first." So I talked. I told him what I had told him in the letter, but out loud, face to face, which is harder and also more honest. I told him about February, about counting days, about 1 visit and a turkey sandwich, about Scottsdale. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I just told him the truth the way you tell a true thing when you've stopped being afraid of the reaction. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. He looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked at me. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," I told him. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm asking you to understand something. I needed you. You chose not to come, and I've spent my whole life making it easy for you not to see what that costs, so I'm done doing that." "What does that mean?" he asked. And his voice had an edge in it, the defensive edge I knew. "It means I love you, and I'm not going anywhere. It also means I've made some changes to make sure my life and what I've built are taken care of appropriately, regardless of what happens between us." I nodded at the envelope. "That's all in there. You can read it at home." He took the envelope when he left. He didn't say much else that evening. He called me 4 days later. His voice was different, quieter. He asked if we could talk again, and I said yes. And he came back on Saturday morning without Renee, just himself. And he sat at my kitchen table and he was more honest with me than he had been in years. He told me that he hadn't known how to be present when things were hard. He told me that watching me in that hospital bed had scared him, and that the fear had made him disappear instead of step forward, which he understood. Now that he said it aloud, made no sense. He told me he was sorry. Not in the quick surface way people sometimes apologize to end a conversation, but slowly, with pauses, like a man who is actually accounting for something. I listened to all of it. I didn't tell him about the will. That wasn't the point of the letter, and it wasn't the point of this conversation. The point was that we were finally talking like two people who were telling the truth to each other, and that was something I hadn't felt with my son in a very long time. I told him the $40,000 no longer needed to be repaid. He started to object, and I held up my hand. "That's not a gift," I said. "That's me closing a chapter. We're not keeping score from here forward. But we also can't pretend things are fine when they aren't. If you want to be in my life, I need you to actually be in it. That means showing up. Not perfectly. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking for present." He nodded for a long time without speaking. Then he asked if he could come for dinner on Sunday. He came Sunday. He's come the last 4 Sundays in a row now. Sometimes he brings Renee. Once he came alone and we watched a game and talked about nothing in particular for 3 hours, and it was the best evening I'd had in longer than I could remember. I don't know what the future holds. I'm 67 years old, and I've learned enough to know that people change slowly, that patterns run deep, and that hope and habit are still hard to tell apart sometimes. But I also know this. I stopped making it easy for him to disappear. I stopped absorbing the hurt and moving on as if nothing had happened. I told him the truth about what I needed, and I made sure that my life, the life I built, every dollar and every year of it, reflected my values and not my fears. Ruth got her letter last week. I wrote to her at the address she'd given me when we were discharged. I told her that a stranger in the room next to mine had said something that changed the way I thought about the last chapter of my life, and that I was grateful for it. She wrote back in 4 days. 2 pages, handwritten, in the clear looping cursive of a woman who spent decades writing on blackboards. She said she was glad I was walking without a cane now. She said her son had driven her to a farmer's market the previous Saturday, and they'd eaten apple cider donuts in the cold, and she'd thought about me, about the conversation in the common room, about how sometimes the thing that helps you most arrives from completely unexpected directions. She said, "Take care of yourself, because you're worth taking care of." I put the letter on the kitchen table where the envelope used to be. I'm still learning how to believe that. But I'm getting there. There's something that happens to a man when he stops lying to himself. It doesn't come all at once. It comes the way February light comes through a rehab facility window, thin and honest and impossible to look away from. I spent a long time believing that love was enough. That if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, forgave enough, the people I loved would eventually rise to meet what I'd given them. I believed that patience was the same thing as wisdom. I was wrong about that. Patience without accountability isn't wisdom. It's just a longer way of teaching someone that their choices have no weight. Every time I absorbed the hurt and moved on, every time my son didn't show up, and I told myself he was busy, he was stressed, he didn't mean it, I was making a choice too. I was choosing his comfort over my own dignity. And what I understand now, lying in that rehab bed counting ceiling tiles, is that a man who never demands to be treated with basic decency will eventually stop believing he deserves it. That's not humility. That's erosion. What changed for me wasn't the fall. The fall was just the moment the truth became too large to step around. What changed was that I finally looked at the pattern clearly, not one incident, not one missed visit, but the whole shape of things, over years, and I let myself see it for what it was. That is what I mean by honesty. Not cruelty, not keeping score. Just seeing the truth and refusing to negotiate it away, because the truth is inconvenient. The hardest part wasn't changing my will or writing the letter. The hardest part was sitting across from my son at that kitchen table and telling him the truth out loud, calmly, without anger, without drama, just the plain facts of what had happened and what it had cost me. That took more from me than anything else in this story, because I love him. I have always loved him. And love makes honesty dangerous because you're risking something real every time you tell a true thing to someone you can't afford to lose. But here's what I've learned. The risk of honesty is smaller than the cost of silence. Silence doesn't protect a relationship. It just postpones the accounting. And the longer you postpone it, the higher the interest gets. My son is showing up now, 4 Sundays in a row. I don't know if it lasts. I'm not naive enough to call it fixed. What I know is that we are finally talking to each other like two men who are telling the truth. And that is something I haven't had with him in years. It came at a cost. Everything real does. I think about Ruth sometimes, the woman in the room next to mine who laughed too loud and asked hard questions and gave me more in 3 weeks than most people give in a decade. She didn't fix anything for me. She just refused to let me lie to myself in her presence. That's the best thing one person can do for another. If there's anything worth taking from what happened to me, it's this. The life you build is yours. Every dollar, every year, every sacrifice yours. You do not owe anyone a legacy that doesn't reflect what you actually value. And the people in your life deserve the truth of who you are, what you need, and what you will no longer accept. Not because it's easy, because it's the only version of a relationship worth having. I'm 67 years old. I walk without a cane now. I have a letter from Ruth on my kitchen table and a son who came for dinner on Sunday. That's where I am. And for the first time in a long while, that feels like enough.